A young girl quietly sits in row 11 of a commercial flight, clutching her backpack, nothing out of the ordinary, until the cockpit suddenly fills with urgent radio chatter. An F-16 escort identifies her not as a passenger, but by a call sign, Falcon. How could a child earn such a name from elite fighter pilots? And why, in this moment, was she the key to what happened next? The air inside the cabin hummed with the familiar white noise of flight. Passengers flipped through magazines, adjusted their seats, or stared absently out the windows at the clouds below. To anyone glancing her way, the girl in row 11 looked ordinary. Knees pulled up slightly, a backpack hugged to her chest, hair tied back in a simple ponytail. She was, by every measure, just another traveler among 100 strangers. But if anyone had looked closer, they might have noticed her sharp, steady gaze. Unlike the restless fidgeting of other children her age, she seemed calm, almost alert, as if waiting. Her eyes didn't just wander. They studied. The engines, the wings, the crew's movements. She noticed everything. The flight was routine until the first shadow cut across the windows. Gasps spread as passengers craned their necks to see. 2 fighter jets, unmistakable F-16 Falcons, had pulled alongside the commercial plane, their gray bodies gleaming against the endless blue. For a moment, the cabin was filled with nervous whispers. Why were they here? Was there danger? The captain's voice came over the intercom, steady but tense. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We are in communication with escort aircraft. Everything is under control. That assurance did little to quiet the unease. Mothers clutched children closer, business travelers exchanged worried glances, and an old man crossed himself. Yet in row 11 the girl didn't panic. Instead, her eyes widened, not in fear, but recognition. She pressed her forehead to the glass, watching as one of the F-16s inched closer, close enough that she could almost see the pilot's face beneath the tinted visor. Then it happened. Through the hum of the engines and the muffled static of the overhead speakers, a crackle of radio chatter seeped in. It wasn't meant for the passengers, but somehow the cabin caught pieces of it. The words were clipped, military, precise. And then a single call sign cut through, Falcon, confirm visual, passenger row 11. The girl froze. The pilots outside weren't just flying beside the plane. They were looking for her. Around her, passengers looked confused. Some thought they had misheard. But a few turned toward row 11, their eyes settling on the quiet child clutching her backpack. She felt the weight of their stares, but she didn't flinch. Slowly, almost instinctively, she straightened in her seat. She wasn't just a kid on this flight. She was someone else, someone known to the men flying those jets. The cabin, once buzzing with fear, now held a new tension. Who was this girl? And why did America's elite fighter pilots know her by name? The name lingered in the air like static. Falcon. The passengers looked around, bewildered, trying to make sense of what they had just heard. The little girl in row 11 sat unnervingly still, as if she had been waiting for this moment. A man across the aisle whispered to his wife, "They can't be talking about her, can they?" But they were. Outside, the F-16s held formation, sleek and unshakable. One banked slightly to the side, giving the girl a full view of the insignia painted near its tail. She recognized it instantly. Her lips pressed together, and for the first time since boarding, her fingers loosened on the straps of her backpack. She had been given that call sign for a reason, and the pilots out there, whoever they were, remembered. Her mind flashed back to the dusty training fields she had once stood on, a world far removed from the cushioned seat of row 11. It wasn't the kind of childhood anyone would believe. Most kids her age were learning multiplication tables, sketching in notebooks, or watching cartoons. But she had been learning hand signals, radio codes, the anatomy of aircraft. Her father, a former test pilot, had treated aviation not just as a career, but as a legacy. From the time she could walk, she had been on the airfields, listening, absorbing, practicing. She was the child who could identify the difference between a Cessna and a Gulfstream by sound alone. The one who memorized fighter jet silhouettes like other children memorized fairy tales. It was during a military demonstration years earlier that the name had been spoken for the first time. A pilot, impressed by her uncanny instincts, had laughed and called her Falcon. The name stuck, echoing across hangars, whispered by those who couldn't believe how much a kid seemed to belong in a world of steel and sky. And now, high above the earth with two warplanes hovering just meters away, the call sign had returned. Not as a joke, not as a memory, but as a recognition. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. A flight attendant, pale but composed, crouched by the girl's row. "Sweetheart," she said softly, Do you know what's happening?" They said your name. The girl's eyes flicked from the attendant to the F-16 outside. For a heartbeat, she said nothing. Then, in a voice steady beyond her years, she whispered, "They're not here for the plane. They're here for me." Gasps rippled through the passengers within earshot. The attendant blinked, unsure if she had misheard. But the girl's expression didn't waver. She had no intention of explaining everything. Not yet. For the pilots outside, the message was already clear. For the first time in the history of that call sign, Falcon was not a code name tossed around by adults. It was the recognition of a child who had already earned a place in their world. And what happened next would prove just how much that name truly meant. The tension in the cabin thickened with every second. Passengers leaned toward the windows, their faces pressed against the glass, staring at the F-16s that shadowed them like silent guardians. The little girl in row 11 sat upright now, no longer hiding, no longer ordinary. The captain's voice returned over the intercom, sharper this time. "We are receiving direct instructions from the escort aircraft. Please remain calm and seated." His words trembled slightly, not from fear of the jets, but from the fact that his flight, his command, was no longer in his hands. One of the F-16s edged even closer, almost wingtip to wingtip with the commercial airliner. Through the cockpit canopy, the pilot raised a gloved hand and tapped his helmet, then pointed directly toward row 11. He wasn't just looking at the plane. He was looking at her. The passengers' murmurs turned into questions, whispers laced with awe and fear. Who was she? And then, almost as if answering him, the situation revealed itself. A second shadow cut across the clouds, this one larger, slower, menacing. Another aircraft was tailing them, closing distance. The girl's sharp eyes locked on the silhouette, and in a single breath, she knew. It wasn't just a random plane. It was a threat. The fighter pilots outside weren't circling for show. They were there to protect. But they needed someone who could confirm what they were up against. Someone who could see it for what it was. And that someone was sitting in row 11. She turned to the nearest attendant, her voice calm, deliberate. "Tell the captain it's not a commercial tale. It's modified. They need to know it's hostile." The attendant froze, confused. But there was something in the girl's tone, the clarity of her words, that carried authority. Against instinct, she relayed the message to the cockpit. Within moments, the pilots outside broke formation, banking hard toward the suspicious aircraft. The sky lit with sudden movement, jets slicing through the clouds in protective arcs. The passengers gasped as the drama unfolded beyond their windows. Most didn't understand what they were seeing, but the girl did. Every maneuver, every signal, every burst of speed. It was language to her, as natural as words on a page. Minutes later, the threat veered off, vanishing into the horizon, escorted firmly away by the F-16s. The danger had passed. The cabin exhaled as one, relief washing through the rows. In row 11, the girl leaned back at last, clutching her backpack again. She wasn't smiling, but her eyes carried something fierce, something earned. The passengers stared at her differently now, some in gratitude, some in awe, others still bewildered. To them she was just a kid, but to the pilots who had called her name, she would always be Falcon. The cabin exhaled as one, relief washing through the rows. In row 11, the girl leaned back at last, clutching her backpack again. She wasn't smiling, but her eyes carried something fierce, something earned. The passengers stared at her differently now, some in gratitude, some in awe, others still bewildered. To them she was just a kid, but to the pilots who had called her name, she would always be Falcon.